I agree with you. I like your shirt.
Oh, thanks, buddy.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, I'm Cody.
And I'm Brent.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review for you the best sci-fi books of all time. This week, we are reviewing the Mars Trilogy. 1, 2, 3, Red, Green, and Blue. And don't forget to like, subscribe, download so you don't miss another episode. The next episode we're doing is on Children of Time. Brent, you want to give us the rundown on the Mars Trilogy real quick?
Yeah, so this week we're talking about the Mars Trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson. 3 books, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. Each of them won either a Hugo or a Nebula Award. They came out between 1992 and 1997, and they're all pretty long, 572 to 750 pages, or if you're listening on audiobook, 24 to 32 hours. So these are long books. There's a lot happening. We're going to get into it. So, let's talk about that. So it's the year 2027. And humanity is colonizing Mars. 100 scientists, engineers, and astronauts take the first colony ship to Mars, across the interplanetary gap, and Red Mars follows about 10 of those first 100 colonists over the first 40 years of life on Mars. They build towns and cities, establish industries, become self-sustaining and sort of able to support themselves without Earth's assistance, and they begin to terraform the red planet as well. And most importantly, sort of for the plot, I guess, is tens of thousands of more people keep immigrating from Earth. And several competing visions for the future of Mars emerge. For instance, there's the Reds who think we shouldn't be terraforming and they really like rocks. There's the Bogdanovists who want sort of an alternative economic system. And everybody on Mars kind of agrees that they don't like immigrants and don't want raw materials getting exported to Earth. And so that sort of sets up this big conflict between what is happening on Mars and what the people living on Mars kind of want to be happening. So yeah, that's the books.
Yeah, and then, after Red Mars, we get Green Mars and Blue Mars as like a continuation of what's happening on Mars.
That's right.
And what's happening on Earth.
With no spoilers, let's just say that they each pick up where the last one left off. Green Mars is kind of a continuation of that same conflict between Earth and Mars. And Blue Mars is more about sort of what happens to the characters after that. Talking about trilogies with no spoilers is tough, but that's what you got. There's a lot that happens in all of them.
Yeah, no, it's helpful to know that they continue like that. So all that being said, I think we're going to rate each book, the series as a total, and then each book overall. And I rate the trilogy as like a 4 out of 5. I think Red 4.5, Green 3.5, Blue 3.5. There's some aspect of dwindling attention span, which we'll talk about. But overall, kind of like a difficult and rare accomplishment by Kim Stanley Robinson in writing, a middle future, very hard science fiction, realistic look at what it might be like to colonize the planet and what that might look for the hegemony of humanity.
For sure. Yeah. So I overall would give it a 3 stars. I agree. It starts off very strongly. I'd give Red Mars a 4, Green Mars a 3, and Blue Mars, though, I would give a 1. I think there's like a really, I think I see the decline a little bit steeper than you do.
Straight 1.
Yeah, I really did not like that book. But yeah, we'll talk about it. So yeah, what should we say about the characters and plot of this book? Who are we talking about and what happens to them?
I think first things first, just worth mentioning, it is not episodic series. Got to read Red, then Blue, then Green, then Blue. Brent, I believe you read, because you were doing a Hugo list. You did Green, then Blue, then Red, and that did not work out for you.
Yeah, it was, in retrospect, everything made like more sense, and it made me appreciate Green Mars more after I read Red Mars. I still think Blue Mars is still just bad. But yes,
sure.
You definitely have to read them in order. Yeah,
and I think, most people approach things that way, but we just find it's helpful to know, because sometimes, like for Korsigan Saga, there's suggested orders, but you could kind of jump in where you want.
Or like the Hainish cycle with Ursula K. Le Guin, you can jump around there. Right. Not in this case, though. Definitely read them in order.
Right. So yeah, basically, the series follows like the first 100, or a select group within them, who colonize Mars. And then in Green Mars, we get the second generation, their children, And then that's kind of where we stop gaining new main characters, because he tells the story in kind of like a third person perspective, but from the events around one character at a time in these large sections. So you'll get, the story of what this character's doing, even though it's still in a kind of a third person omnipotent voice. You're just seeing what this character is doing and how they're interacting with the other characters. And then the next section is a different character. So seeing that through the first and second generation of characters, it's an interesting authorial voice for him to use, because it feels almost like you're going to see the voice of each character through their section, and you get a little more of them. His dialogue is quite good. You get a little more of them because you're following them the whole time, but it's not really from their perspective. You're still hearing the thoughts and feelings of other characters at the same time. And it doesn't really feel like the voice switches. It's very consistent. So whether or not you're following one character or the other, you're not really feeling the character through the writing itself. Hence the third person omnipotent perspective there. But it does really work in the story, I think. And I think it's because his dialogue is strong, and his description is, albeit dense, it is quite detailed.
Yes, we will get into that a little bit more too. Yeah, I think that I'll just gripe about the characters a little bit. I think they start off really strong, but because the book covers such a long period of time, Kim Stanley Robinson does something pretty interesting, which is he tries to have and does have the characters change a fairly large amount throughout the books. So normally that's something I really enjoy. The thing I don't like here, and that took me out of it pretty significantly, is that as humans, we actually tell ourselves stories about our lives, right? Like when we change, there's usually like, I am telling myself that this is why this is happening to me. This is a good thing. That's okay. And because we never really get into the heads of the characters, you don't get to feel that story of themselves. So watching from the outside, you're like seeing this person do different things, and it feels harder to know them, if that makes any sense. And that leads me to feeling sometimes like they're doing things that like aren't internally consistent with how they think and feel. Happens more in the later books. In Red Mars, I didn't really feel that way. But anyway, small point, but I think there's something interesting there about story. And I think there's something there about like what makes a good novel is like we all want our lives to be like a story, right? And in some ways it didn't feel like you could like see that story of the characters in these books.
I feel like this doesn't always happen. But I disagree. I think that you're getting the thoughts, and you're seeing inside their heads you're seeing inside the heads of many characters at the same time, not just necessarily the character you're following. But I do think you get a really strong sense of some of the characters, not necessarily all of the characters, but I feel like a lot of them are quite well defined in their aspirations, how they change. And that was one of maybe my favorite parts of this series from a story perspective, because we'll get into how they're not stories in the traditional narrative sense, but I think that's what held me that was the thing holding me in the story perspective, was that the characters, was watching them grow, change, and the decisions they made.
Yeah, interesting.
So since we don't disagree a lot, definitely comment how you felt about this if you're watching YouTube, or feel free to shoot us an email at hugonautspodcast@gmail.com, because we'd love to hear. I don't know. We don't disagree a lot. It'd be nice to hear what other people thought about this.
Yeah, for sure. So what about the themes here? Yeah.
This is hard science fiction. There's some people use the term now mundane science fiction, which is like where you're not extrapolating any science that we don't already know is possible. There's no like FTL drives, for example. But he is jumping in the future. So there's new technology, but it's not necessarily anything that's not well described. And it is well described here.
So
Kim Stanley
much
Robinson,
detail,
just
yeah.
so much detail the whole time, perhaps why they're so long. And about, not only about the science, but also about the soft sciences too, right?
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part of the series, particularly in Red Mars and Green Mars, is we're seeing like literally the planet get built, but we're also very much seeing like society get built. And it just felt so much, it felt like I was like seeing what it might have been like to live in like revolutionary times in America. As an American, that's like our, thing we think about, where there's like because there's like a small enough group of people that they can all like talk to each other. Like literally everybody who has an opinion about the future of Mars, like they personally know each other and they have chatted about it. And it is so interesting to think about a world like that, where our politics now is so, there's so many people, like you can't really, it's all about like getting, the politicians are all trying to get like other random people to agree with them. They don't really actually like talk to each other. And it just was a really interesting view into that like smaller world. And how do you think about like the creating of a beginning of a society? And I don't necessarily like agree with all the ideas that come out, but I loved that like really interesting feeling of creation, both of the planet and of the society. And that was really, really, really cool.
There's 2 constitutional congresses. Like they have, not only are there a bunch of scientific, what's the word I'm looking for? Conferences in especially Green Mars and Blue Mars, but there's a constitutional congress in each one. And there's a lot of like lawmaking, policy making. How does Mars deal with Earth? How do they deal with immigration? What does everyone want to do about industry on the planet? And yeah, it goes on.
It surely does.
It reads honestly, especially Green and Blue Mars, read more like historical fiction about something, about a fictional future. They're very just concerned with maybe this is what will happen in our future, and in a very real sense, like this is what people act like. And he's got such a good grasp of that. But there's really no arc that's like, there really aren't a lot of arcs that are like, here's where the characters are going, here's some mystery, what's going to happen, in the way that we normally tell stories, where we're seeing it in a scope that has like a beginning and an end. It feels kind of like an amorphous. It has a beginning, and there are little arcs in between, but there's kind of an amorphous, long, just exploring what humans might do if Mars were colonized.
Yeah, I had more patience for the constitutional conventions because it felt like the big conflict in Red and Green Mars is like, how will Mars be governed? What will the relationship with Earth be? And so at least those really long meetings, which is it really does feel like a long meeting. But at least I feel like it's like advancing the central plot, and it's like, okay, we're going to figure out like what these people are going to be advocating for. By the time you get to Blue Mars, like that conflict is resolved, but you still have like a lot of really long meetings and like scientific conferences. The scientific conferences, even in the earlier ones, kind of irked me because there was literally no like plot advancement. It's just like many pages in a row of like, let's talk about whether the windmills that we dropped on the planet to create heat like worked. And it's like very long explanation of that. And it's, on the one hand, it's like interesting how deeply he thought about those things. On the other hand, reading scientific papers that are made up is like, maybe you're pretty deep in a rabbit hole at that point. So anyway, yeah,
that's true. And he also, I found another interesting thing about the scientific conferences was how he talked about academic like ego and the different academics vying against each other and like slighting someone's work because they were slighted by that person. Like this scientist slighted this scientist. So when this scientist does their presentation, they forget to reference the very relevant work of this other scientist. And so it feels, all of the novels feel very real. They're so detailed, so rich, and so realistic. There's just like, we usually see that in good writing. We see that detailed richness then applied to a fictional narrative that has a beginning and an end, and the authors decided how to guide us through that beginning and an end, because in real life we just kind of keep going, right? And so the advantage of storytelling is that we get this artificial sense of of something beginning and resolving, or at least if it doesn't resolve all the way, it's kind of bittersweet, but it still feels like an end. And that's important in our storytelling. Here, not so much. Like I said, it just keeps it's almost maybe too real. Maybe that's why you didn't like it. I liked that for a bit, but I'm also notoriously like, if I start something, I'll finish it, and if it's long enough, I'll end up liking it. So
yeah, for sure. That's how I feel about Blue Mars. Like, if you're a person who loves to, like, you want to finish the series that you started, and it's really important to feel like you like read the whole arc, then do. But if you're not that kind of person, which like I'm not necessarily, I want to read really good stuff. Like, that's my like life thing. Like, you know, I maybe wouldn't have read Blue Mars if I could like pick again. Red and Green Mars for sure, but Blue Mars, like, you know, I don't know. I don't like choose to attend scientific conferences that I don't have expertise in, like in the real world, you know? So I think that's like a pretty good indication. I think most people don't either.
As we keep talking about this, it makes sense to me to bring back up that Red Mars does not feel this way. It's kind of Green Mars and Blue Mars being tacked onto the end. Red Mars does feel like it's wrapped up nicely. There's a ton of mystery. There's an interesting arc. The way it's formatted, like how it begins.
Yeah, he uses like a different narrative structure too. He does like
exactly.
He has like foreshadowing and flashbacks and flashes forward to like build that tension and keep you invested in the plot and what's going to resolve. And he did not do those things in Green Mars and Blue Mars. I think maybe it's because Red Mars is really successful and he was getting a lot of pressure to like produce the sequels quickly. That's a really, I think, common thing that happens to writers. But you can just tell it felt to me like there was less attention put into that. Like, how do I, you know, I've got this story that I want to tell. How do I like make it feel like a cohesive whole and make it feel like that arc? So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, to make it feel like the artificial storytelling, which I was talking about. Yeah, he just kind of launches it.
Yep.
From Green Mars and Blue Mars. Although, you know, Blue Mars does have used the characters to kind of bring the whole thing to some sense of fruition. So I don't think personally that it's totally a wash. But it is, you know, you're in for some attention to detail and some, if you like thinking about tent cities, space elevators, automated equipment, moleholes and how they work, like mining of nitrogen from asteroids and like moon planets. I'm just looking at a list we have here.
Yeah, there's
genetic
like so
engineering
much stuff. Yeah.
And every soft science too, like economics discussed in just so much detail and explored in so much detail. Psychology explored in so much detail. What happens if we live longer? Like, there's just all science and soft sciences really explored through these characters in this place that he's built.
Yeah. So if you're into, you know, how literally very step by step, how to do like very large, interesting engineering projects, and, you know, what would happen if you dug a giant kilometer wide mole into Mars to go way down deep near the surface, and how much heat that would release into the atmosphere, and how much total heat do you need to make it livable on the surface? Like, all those kinds of like very technical questions about terraforming and these big engineering projects. Like, if that sounds exciting to you, these are your books. Like, for sure, you're going to love them.
Yeah. And again, I think what Kim Stanley Robinson does so masterfully is writes this middle future science fiction, right? And it's such hard science fiction, but it's also incredible that he's written something that happens just after kind of our period, right? He's writing in the 90s, so it's about 20 years in the future for him, only 5 years in the future for us. We'll see if we get there. But what's tough to write about middle future stuff is that you're not creating a fictional world where you can kind of make the rules and imagine it yourself. And you're also not writing with our world in mind, where you can just play off of things you see happening around you and write, you know, just like normal fiction. You have to create something new that makes sense that it came from the now. And I think that's a lot harder of a line to ride as an author, or I'm sure it is. I've not tried it myself. But I can only imagine it's a lot harder to do that because you have to make it believable based on the now, but also novel and imagine where we'll go next. And make those educated guesses believable. And I think he's just done such a good job at that. And it's why it's rare. You don't see it as much because it's, I think, just really technically difficult and creatively difficult to do.
Yeah, for sure. No, he definitely pulled something very cool off here.
Do you feel like there's any, is there anything for you that like bugged you about that? I mean, we're talking about middle future that like brought you out of it a little bit, or you thought he misunderstood? Like,
yeah, there are a couple things. So he simultaneously has like all this incredible technology, and they're with, frankly, not that much time and effort, like making Mars into a habitable place. That's a very hard task, but they have all these incredible automated machines that with like very little human involvement can do these giant projects. But then at the same time, he's got like a huge percentage of the population of Earth is like starving to death. And there's all these like he's always talking about how there's resource constraints, but at the same time, we're seeing how they can make like unimaginable abundance with almost no human labor. And so it almost feels like kind of defeatist to me, like, and somewhat internally inconsistent as well, because like, if we can do all this stuff, like, how is there not enough food? Like plowing a field is not hard if you have an automated robot that can do these crazy construction projects on a foreign planet. Like, that did take me out of it a little bit.
That's part of the push and pull of the series, right? Is that's why Earth wants to move to Mars so badly, because they have all that stuff on Mars.
Earth sent all the machines. The Earth sent all the machines to Mars that did the terraforming. They clearly have them.
That like, makes but I guess one of the points is that Mars, it's the Mars, like, should we be isolationist and say we made this, if you figure it out on Earth? Or should we include them because it's inevitable that if we don't include them and bring them up with us, they'll just overrun us? And they eventually, even to your example, in Green or Blue Mars, they do send the bots and like teach the Earth humans how to use them to make more food. So that's not an issue anymore.
I hear you, but like the Earth humans sent the bots in the first place to Mars. And the other thing that happens here that people listening to the podcast and or video wouldn't know that, but in my real life, I spend my time like working on housing and trying to fix the housing crisis in America. And reading these books felt so reminiscent to me of like the arguments I hear all the time about why housing is too expensive on Earth. It's like, oh, there's not enough land, but like, that's not true at all. Kim Stanley Robinson just like wants everyone to live in like a really small, quaint village and have like 14 acres per person. But like, we already don't need that on Earth. Like, there is no shortage of space. We have plenty of space. He's talking about like a Malthusian problem because there's like 10 billion people. And like, that's just not at all the case. Like, it's, people always throughout history, and it's very common in sci-fi, they're always projecting like, oh, in the future, we're like about to run out of resources. But what actually keeps happening is we keep having more resources per person. Like, in general, life has gotten better for many, many, many hundreds of years in a row. And so it just irks me a little bit when sci-fi like falls back on that, like, oh, well, but very soon we'll have too many people and everything's going to collapse. And it's like, well, is it? That keeps not happening. You know what I mean?
Right. And I think that plays on people's, especially for more, like we were talking about earlier, like stories, like post-apocalyptic, for example, plays on people's egos in that, like, oh, well, of course I wouldn't be the one to die. It'd be kind of cool. And like, if everyone else dies, then that means I get to stop like answering emails and I can just think about like growing tomatoes or whatever. Which, by the way, you can do at any time you want. If you want to just step out.
So should we tie a bow around this baby? If people loved this book, what else should they be reading?
I was just stuttering for a second because I was looking at our notes. I mean, a lot of times our pre-production documents are like bullet point, talk about this, we'll free flow about this. This one is as dense as the trilogy, isn't it? So I was just trying to read where we were, but I feel like we pretty much covered everything we wanted to talk about. I think ultimately, this is the first thing we've kind of disagreed on, which is interesting, or disagreed on a lot of aspects of. I liked it a lot better than you did. I think we both agreed Red Mars was great.
So great.
And then you fell off quicker than I did on Green and Blue Mars, but they're great. It's a great trilogy it's a perfect trilogy for you if you're incredibly into hard science fiction and exploring all aspects of human science, from the hardest physical elements to the softest human organizational elements. It does all of the ones that you learned there was a name for in high school. So if you like that, you'll love this trilogy. And if you like a little bit of that and you want a little bit of characters, I still think you'll love the trilogy. But you are in for a read.
Yes, no doubt. So if people love this book, what else should they be reading?
Recommendations. Well, why don't you start?
Sure. I will start with Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke.
Which we recently reviewed.
We did. Yeah. It's also very hard sci-fi and feels, I think there's like a lot of parallels actually, because there's no super clear plot arc. It's like, hey, I'm just going to tell you about a thing in the future that might happen. And it's a very cool thing. There's like this unidentified object coming into the solar system. And as it gets closer, it sure looks a whole lot like a spaceship. And so they got to figure out what's going on with that and explore it. So anyway, very cool book. We did check out our episode on it. And if you're if you like the Mars Trilogy, I'm very confident you're going to like Rendezvous with Rama.
Absolutely. I think it's a great rec. And you can check out our episode on that one too if you want like a little more in depth before you start reading it. The other one is kind of obvious. I think it's the Expanse series. Similar perspective, although that is third person limited instead of kind of like third person omnipotent following around one person. But, you get a similar sense of like what's happening in different areas of the solar system with each character. And it's also got a similar hard science fiction feel in that we really the world building is James Corey's world building is really about the details as well. And then another one that's about the details is The Martian.
Yeah, we'll close that out with the most obvious recommendation for this one, but it's actually I'm sure, there's a lot in common with these again. The Martian is like real hard sci-fi. There's a lot of like orbital mechanics stuff that you're going to learn about. In some ways you could honestly maybe argue that like The Martian is like the prequel to the Mars Trilogy. Like in the Mars Trilogy, they talk about how there was like the first expedition to Mars that was just temporary. Like maybe that was The Martian. Anyway, so yeah, check it out. It's really, really great, really fun. And Andy Weir had such a really cool breakout story as a new author with that book. So anyway, yeah, definitely a fun one.
Yeah. And as we usually say, but the recommendations go both ways. Probably in this episode, perhaps it's more likely that people listening are more familiar with Martian or The Expanse in particular than they are with the Mars Trilogy. And if you've read those books and you want the denser version that's way more realistic and level tone and just about life going on, then Mars Trilogy is for you. Other than that, Brent, I bid you farewell, and we will see everyone next time.
Absolutely. Keep reading, everybody. Bye.
All right. Later.